How's it going, folks? Welcome back to our podcast. Today we have
John,
Caitlyn,
Tyler,
and I am Jared. We're here to chat about a couple of pieces that we read in our Intro to Literary Studies class. Those pieces being Theory as Liberatory Practice by Bell Hooks and What is Literature by Terry Eagleton.
one of the things I wanted to talk about with What is Literature is kind of the ending paragraphs on page 13 and 14, where Eagleton brings up how the Cambridge critic Richards demonstrated how whimsical and subjective literary value judgments can be by giving his undergraduates a set of poems, withholding from them the titles and authors' names, and asking them to evaluate them. To me, as Eagleton went on to describe this and kind of talk about it within this piece, I thought that it really is true. It really shows that circumstances of the presentation of pieces is highly effective of the receptiveness and how highly regarded the piece may be. Is that something you guys have noticed within classes or even your own experiences? If you don't know who the author is of a certain piece, you'll regard it more highly, or have you noticed people tend to do that?
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah.
Especially with other mediums like film, TV, sports even, music. You see if something is extremely highly regarded, or if it's cooler to like a certain thing or whatever, people will parade to it.
Yeah, and I think it's really interesting how we don't really define who the critics are. Nobody ever knows the names behind who the critics are. Who decides who's this really cool artist or producer? We almost never know producers' names for who's making the songs and the music we listen to. But people will all of a sudden pop off, and then a lot of people tend to think certain movies or certain songs are overhyped when they listen to them.
Yeah, that's a good point. I think it kind of goes with what he was talking about when it comes to value, making value judgments. Here he says, there's no such thing as a literary work or tradition which is valuable in itself, regardless of what anyone might have said or come to say about it.
Yeah, it's almost like they aren't really questioned on it. And also, if something is given a high regard, I feel like people automatically pay more attention to it.
Yeah, for sure.
For sure.
They almost assume that there's a deeper meaning, which might not necessarily be there because people have decided that it's an important piece.
Right, and even when they don't know for sure, and it's just kind of placed upon them.
Yeah, it's just speculative.
I guess in a sense what we can say is Eagleton is kind of exposing the elite schools such as Cambridge and how they use literature as a tool to shape and discipline students for the ruling class instead of helping them use literature for creativity, freedom, and to really understand a deeper meaning of a text.
Yeah, and I think that's really true because Eagleton really talks about, who decides what's important, right? And I like to think about, especially after reading this piece, is I always questioned in high school, right? Why am I reading these old white men's interpretation of, what's going on in here instead of, more feminist pieces, more pieces by women, right? Because it's been a long time since we've uncovered a lot of really important literature to a lot of different minorities and people who have been struggling, and why we don't use those in education to talk about certain things. And instead, I feel like it's almost an indoctrination of you have to think this piece is important, right? Because while I'll use, for example, 1989, while yes, it has great perspectives on authoritative ruling, capitalism and communism together. At the same time, it's also full of misogyny and things that are really hard to take away from that have very little importance and are actually just really terrible takes on things. And to have to go through that in high school and have to analyze a piece and talk about what you took away from it, when in actuality it's just very upfront misogynistic things that to analyze are just unimportant and have really no stake on the book itself, and was, I feel, a very unnecessary portion of the book, even looking at the time that it was written. But to me, I absolutely agree with you. I think that there's a lot of almost perpetual upholding of certain pieces instead of questioning them, especially in these Ivy League schools.
Yeah, Caitlyn. I guess what you're saying kind of ties back to Bell Hooks' theory as liberatory practice and how she basically discusses literature being inclusive and relatable for marginalized groups.
Yeah, it talks a lot about how white women especially often present a lot of literary pieces, and even if they like quote or say that they drew their inspiration from other texts, oftentimes they aren't quoted or even cited for sources, and oftentimes even really important pieces from more marginalized groups of women are misconstrued to be from a white woman or someone who has been classically more important and given that stage and light instead of really drawing it from its core and people understanding that it comes from a different place.
So I guess like my personal perspective on that is like, I feel like that's when you start, it's easier said than done, but that's when you kind of start and pave your way and let your voice be known and heard instead of like just sitting there.
Yeah.
Like just being overlooked and allowing it to happen.
Yeah, I think she goes on to talk about that quite a bit and how like people, when she was in groups of black women, how they didn't want to focus on theory and talk about those things, and they weren't very supportive of, you know, bringing their voices up in that way. And they wanted to focus more on like what they considered to be action-oriented things. But that also brings me to another point of like, in recent years, there have been a more like proactive effort to join hands on women of minority and white women on, you know, how do we share the stage, right? And for me, like my own personal experience, like when I was like 14, 15, I had to learn how to step down from feminism from my point of view. And I realized there are different points of views and like different forms of oppression that women of different races face that I didn't know about. So for me, like what became most important for me at that time was instead of holding the mic is handing it over and figuring out how I can, you know, make the stage a little bit higher for the women whose voices aren't necessarily given a fighting chance.
Yeah, I think what you're touching on is the intersectionality of marginalized people and how different people will relate to a theory or a literary practice or something in different ways, which I think relates back to what Mr. Eagle Guy was talking about with just how anything can be literature, and if it's really up to the reader to decipher.
On page 10, Eagleton says, just as people may treat work as philosophy in one century as literature in the next, or vice versa, so they may change their minds about what writing they consider valuable. I think this is something about perception, as the entire what is literature passage is about perception and how we conceive art and the pedestal we put on it. I think it goes to show that, you know, anything could be literature in the sense of, like, I guess if we look at newspapers from 100 years ago or even 30 years ago, kind of like seeing this forgotten past, that could be moving to the average person and whatnot. And I feel like seeing even like a sports game or something of your favorite team from 30 years ago you remember watching as a kid, that could be literature to you, reading a newspaper from back in the day about it. So I think literature, what could be literature, whatever it is, or there's a difference between something that's literary and what literature is, as Eagleton discusses, but I feel like the whole point I'm trying to make is that reading something that impacts you, no matter what it is, even like reading like the First Amendment or something, if that moves you or whatnot, I guess that can be conceived as literature to whatever you're interested in. It's like, depends on what caters to you. So I feel like, you know, whatever truly moves you or whatever really motivates you to do something, whatever passage of text like really sticks with you in your brain, that's what I consider literature. I don't think literature has to be this like set, you know, great American novel kind of ordeal. I think it could be whatever, you know, sticks with you or whatever you think is important.
Agreed, and I think that's what Eagleton's point was with a lot of it, and I really feel like that translates to theory as liberatory practice with bell hooks as well, because I really feel like she really touched on the point of like who decides what is the status quo and who decides what's important and what counts as theory and what theory does for us, and that really connects back to Eagleton on like what is literature and what does literature do for us and who decides what is what.
Basically, like literature, the meaning of literature is in the eyes of the beholder.
Exactly.
Yeah.
That's a great point.
I do believe that there should be like a certain like recommended list, probably a more modern one that isn't as.
Yeah,
like,
I think it needs to be updated.
Yeah, there needs. I think
We need to question these critics a
I
little
think
bit.
it is great to have a list of like the classics or the highly regarded ones, so we know like the starting points and like the things we could reference in great art and whatnot that we could agree on. I think as a society that's not a bad thing to do, but it's a problem when we're using outdated texts or stuff that's just irrelevant or stuff with like very perplexing undertones that are like kind of just outdated ways of thinking and stuff.
Yeah.
Like stuff like that you just leave in the past.
Well, that's all the time we have today, folks. What a thoughtful and provocative conversation about literature and theory and what those things can be and who they're for. I had a great time chatting with you all. Until next time, do.
Dude.